Something happened in the last 48 hours that most mainstream analysts are completely ignoring, and I genuinely believe it changes the entire trajectory of what comes next. In the span of a single week, 3 separate signals fired at the same time. Iran's supreme leader surfaced with a direct public statement unlike anything we have heard in years. Unusual naval movements were logged near the Strait of Hormuz, and the President of the United States spent the early morning hours reposting artificial intelligence memes instead of addressing any of it. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a drill. This is not political noise. What is unfolding right now has the potential to affect oil prices, your cost of living, and the stability of an entire region. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this one moves fast, and I will be back the moment anything breaks. Let me show you exactly what is happening, layer by layer. Before we talk about what happened this week, I need to give you the foundation, because without it, nothing else makes sense. This conflict did not start last Tuesday. It did not start last year. What we are watching right now is the result of a 47-year standoff between the United States and Iran, one that has never been fully resolved, only temporarily managed. Here is the compressed version. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution fundamentally rewired Iran's relationship with the West. From that moment forward, Washington and Tehran have existed in a permanent state of structured hostility, not quite war, not quite peace, something far more dangerous, a frozen confrontation that periodically thaws into crisis. In 2015, the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal designed to cap Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for sanctions relief. It was imperfect. Critics on both sides had legitimate complaints, but it existed. It was a framework. In 2018, the Trump administration walked away from that framework entirely. No replacement deal was offered, maximum pressure sanctions were reimposed, and Iran, predictably, began expanding its nuclear program in direct response. Now, here we are in 2025, and this week, something shifted. I want you to pay close attention to the timing. Iran did not issue this week's statements on a random Tuesday. They chose Persian Gulf National Day in the 29th of April, a date that carries enormous symbolic weight inside Iran. It commemorates the expulsion of foreign colonial powers from the Persian Gulf in 1622. That choice of date is not accidental. In Iranian political culture, symbolism and timing are inseparable from intention. And then consider this. The Ayatollah himself made a direct public statement, not through a spokesperson, not through state media framing, directly. The last time we saw that specific pattern, a direct, unambiguous personal statement from the supreme leader preceding a major escalation, was before the missile strikes of January 2020. Now, I'm not telling you history is repeating itself exactly. I am telling you the pattern is worth examining very carefully. Do you see what is happening here? One decision in 2018 created a chain reaction that is still accelerating today. And this week, we may be looking at the moment that chain reaches its next critical link. Keep that in your mind as we go deeper, because the details get significantly more serious from here. Let us talk about what was actually said, because the words matter enormously here, and I do not think most people are reading them carefully enough. The Ayatollah's statement this week contained one line that I keep coming back to. The only place America belongs in the Persian Gulf is at the bottom of its waters. Now, I have spent considerable time studying how Iranian leadership communicates publicly versus how they communicate diplomatically. And there is a critical distinction that is being missed in most coverage right now. This is not rhetoric designed for a domestic audience. Iranian leaders use a completely different register of language when they are performing for internal consumption. This statement was structured, deliberate, and posted in a format clearly intended for international visibility. That distinction matters more than the words themselves. Then consider the second element. Iran will never surrender, repeated twice in the same statement. I need you to understand something about Iranian diplomatic communication. Deliberate repetition within a single formal statement is not emphasis for dramatic effect. In the context of how this government has historically signaled its intentions, repetition functions as a form of official commitment. It is the linguistic equivalent of signing something twice. Again, this is my reading of the pattern. I encourage you to seek additional expert perspectives, but the pattern is there. Now let us zoom out to the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the abstract becomes very, very concrete. Every single day, approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply moves through that strait. 20%. We are talking about a channel of water roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through it flows the energy that powers homes, factories, and economies across Asia, Europe, and beyond. The estimated value of cargo passing through daily is somewhere in the range of $20 billion. Iran has conducted naval exercises simulating a closure of the strait at least 3 times since 2019. Each time, global oil markets responded within hours. Now sit with this for a moment. We are not talking about a hypothetical disruption to some abstract financial instrument. We are talking about the price of getting to work in the morning, the cost of heating your home, the number you see at the grocery checkout. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, even for 72 hours, the economic shockwave reaches every household in the developed world before the week is out. So what was the response from Washington? In the 6 hours immediately following the Ayatollah's statement, the President of the United States posted about a late-night television host. He posted criticism of the German Chancellor. He shared artificial intelligence-generated images of himself holding military-style weapons. And he referred to the Strait of Hormuz as the Strait of Trump on social media, a post that Iranian officials publicly mocked within the hour. I want to be precise here, because I think precision matters. I am not interested in cheap mockery of any sitting president. What I am genuinely asking, as an analyst, as someone who watches these signals professionally, is this. Where is the strategic countersignal? When an adversary issues a formal escalatory statement through their highest authority, the international community looks for a calibrated response, not a tweet, a signal. Now, and this is important, some serious analysts argue that the absence of a conventional response is itself a strategy. The theory holds that unpredictability keeps adversaries off balance, that Trump's unconventional communication style deliberately obscures American intentions. That is a legitimate argument. I do not dismiss it. But here is the problem with that theory this week. Unpredictability works as a deterrent when the other side is uncertain about your capabilities and resolve. When Iran's supreme leader is publicly declaring finality, never surrender, repeated on Persian Gulf Day, the calculus may have shifted beyond the point where ambiguity functions as leverage. That is the tension at the center of everything happening right now. And it is about to get considerably more complicated. Let me slow down here for a moment, because this is the part where I think most commentary goes wrong. It is very easy to look at this situation and collapse it into a simple narrative. Good guys, bad guys, obvious answers. But if you are genuinely trying to understand what comes next, you need to hold 3 separate scenarios in your mind simultaneously. And you need to be honest about the evidence pointing toward each one. So let us walk through them carefully. Scenario A is the outcome everyone in this room, regardless of political affiliation, should want: successful diplomacy. A negotiated framework that verifiably limits Iran's nuclear program in exchange for meaningful sanctions relief. Talks in Oman are still technically ongoing as of this week. Iran has not formally withdrawn from the negotiating table. And it is worth noting that even this week's aggressive public statements do not necessarily contradict back-channel diplomacy. In fact, historical precedent suggests that public escalation sometimes accompanies private negotiation as a pressure tactic. Analysts at institutions like the RAND Corporation and the International Crisis Group have placed the probability of a workable diplomatic outcome somewhere in the range of 30 to 35% under current conditions. That is not zero. That is real. And I think it deserves to be said clearly, fans, because pessimism is not the same as analysis. Scenario B is what I currently assess as the most probable trajectory, and frankly, it is the one that should concern you most precisely because it is not dramatic enough to generate sustained attention. This is the slow bleed scenario. Iran continues incrementally expanding uranium enrichment, not to weapons grade, but close enough to maintain maximum negotiating leverage. The United States maintains its military presence and economic pressure without triggering a direct confrontation. Oil prices remain elevated. Inflation continues grinding upward. The American economy absorbs the damage quietly, month by month, while the political cost accumulates in ways that do not show up in any single headline. Nobody declares victory. Nobody declares defeat. And ordinary people, on both sides of this, pay the price in ways that are diffuse enough to be deniable by everyone in power. I need you to sit with that for a moment. The slow bleed is not exciting. It does not generate breaking news banners. But historically, it is the scenario that causes the most cumulative damage precisely because it never reaches the threshold that forces resolution. Scenario C is the one I approach with the most caution because it is both the most dramatic and the most susceptible to irresponsible speculation. The worst case is not a planned war. Planned conflicts, paradoxically, tend to have off-ramps built into them. The genuine danger is an unplanned escalation, a miscalculation at sea, a misidentified vessel, a communications failure during a tense naval encounter in a 21-mile strait where multiple military forces are operating in close proximity. History is full of wars that nobody intended to start. I am not predicting this outcome. I want to be unambiguous about that. What I am saying is that the structural conditions for accidental escalation are currently elevated in ways that deserve serious attention rather than dismissal. Now, here is where I want to give genuine credit to the opposing argument, because intellectual honesty requires it. The case for the current American approach is not trivial. Supporters argue that spending $25 billion now to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran is categorically cheaper, economically, strategically, and in human terms, than the alternative. They argue that every previous administration that chose negotiation over pressure ultimately enabled Iran to advance its program further. They point to the genuine regional terror threat that an emboldened, nuclear-capable Iran would represent for American allies across the Middle East. These are serious arguments made by serious people, and the counter-argument that maximum pressure without a clear diplomatic endgame risks replicating the strategic failures of Iraq in 2003 is equally serious. The truth that nobody in cable news wants to say out loud is this: both positions contain genuine insight. Both positions contain genuine blind spots, and the space between them is exactly where the most consequential decisions of the next several months will be made, by people operating with incomplete information under enormous pressure in real time. That is not a comfortable place to be, but it is the accurate one, and accurate is where we have to start. Here is where I want to slow down and show you three specific details that most coverage is simply not connecting. And when you see them together, the picture looks significantly different than what you are getting from the headlines. Pay close attention here. This is the part that matters. Detail number one. Pete Hegseth went to Capitol Hill this week, 2 consecutive days, House then Senate, to testify about a potential military confrontation with Iran. That is the stated purpose of those hearings. And yet, the single most prominent line to emerge from his testimony was this: the biggest adversary facing the United States right now is congressional Democrats. I need you to sit with that framing for a moment. The Defense Secretary of the United States testifying before Congress about a foreign adversary that has just issued a formal escalatory statement through its supreme leader chose to define the primary threat as domestic political opposition. Now, there's a strategic logic to this that deserves acknowledgement. Controlling the domestic narrative during a military engagement is a legitimate component of wartime communication. Every administration does it to some degree. But there is a meaningful difference between managing the narrative and replacing the substantive conversation entirely, because here is what did not get answered in those 2 days of testimony. What is the exit strategy? What are the specific conditions under which military operations conclude? What does success look like, and who defines it? These are not partisan questions. They are the foundational questions of any military engagement, and their absence from the public record this week is a detail worth examining very carefully. Detail number 2. Donald Trump spent a significant portion of this week publicly attacking Germany's chancellor, accusing him of ineffectiveness and interference. Strong language directed at one of America's most important NATO partners. And yet, simultaneously, a senior American official told CBS News that no options regarding troop reductions in Germany have even been presented to the president. Not discussed, not proposed, not on the table. Furthermore, Germany is currently providing what officials describe as quiet but meaningful logistical support to American forces operating in the Middle East. So we have a situation where the president is publicly undermining a NATO ally that is privately supporting the American military mission he is publicly championing. And Secretary Rubio is on the phone with the German foreign minister at the same time. Do you see what is happening here? The public signal and the private reality are moving in completely opposite directions. That gap between what is being said publicly and what is being done operationally is precisely the kind of institutional confusion that adversaries study and exploit. Detail number 3, and this one stopped me completely when I read it. Israel's defense minister stated this week that it may soon be necessary to, and I am quoting directly here, act again in Iran. Again. That single word carries an enormous amount of weight, because it is an implicit acknowledgement that previous action did not achieve its stated objective. The threat was not eliminated. It was temporarily disrupted. If you are Iran's strategic planning apparatus, that word tells you something critical about your adversary's assessment of the current situation. Subscribe right now, because Israel's next calculated move in this sequence is something I am watching extremely closely, and I will break it down the moment the picture becomes clearer. Zoom out and look at all 3 details simultaneously. You have a defense secretary reframing the threat as domestic. You have an alliance showing public fracture and private cooperation at the same time. And you have Israel signaling that the previous chapter is unfinished. 3 fires, 1 building, and nobody appears to be coordinating which door to exit from. I want to bring this down to ground level for a moment, because everything we have discussed so far can start to feel abstract when we are talking about supreme leaders and naval straits and diplomatic frameworks. So let me make this concrete. Let me tell you what this actually costs. The first quarter GDP numbers dropped this week. The American economy grew at an annualized rate of 2%. That sounds acceptable until you understand that the projection was 2.3%, and that the gap between projection and reality is not a rounding error. It is a directional signal. The economy is decelerating at precisely the moment it is being asked to absorb the costs of an extended military engagement. Then look at the inflation numbers. Personal consumption expenditures, the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure, jumped to 3.5% in March of 2025. That is the highest reading since May of 2023. Core PCE, which strips out food and energy, came in at 3.2%, the highest since January of 2024. Here is what those numbers mean in plain language. The prices you are paying right now are not coming down. They are going up. And the primary accelerant is energy costs driven directly by instability in the Persian Gulf region. I need you to understand the direct mechanical connection here. Elevated tension near the Strait of Hormuz pushes oil futures higher. Higher oil futures flow immediately into gasoline prices, then into transportation costs, then into the price of every physical product that moves on a truck or a plane. Your grocery bill, your utility statement, the cost of every delivery you order, all of it is downstream from what happens in that 21-mile stretch of water. Now here is the opposing argument, and I want to give it its full weight. Several Republican Congress members made a point this week that is not without historical merit. Short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term regional security is a trade that has precedent. The Gulf War of 1991 caused a significant oil price spike, and then when the conflict concluded decisively and quickly, prices stabilized and the economy recovered. The critical variable in that equation is the word decisively. A clear objective, a defined endpoint, a measurable outcome. The question I keep returning to, and I am asking this genuinely, not rhetorically, is whether those 3 conditions currently exist in a form that the American public, the markets, and crucially the adversary can all recognize simultaneously. because without a visible finish line, the economic pressure does not pause. It compounds. And at 3.5% inflation with decelerating growth, the compounding has already begun. Let me bring everything together, because after everything we have walked through today, three things are undeniably clear. First, Iran issued a formal escalatory signal this week through its highest authority on a symbolically chosen date. That is not noise. That is a deliberate communication designed to be read as finality. Second, the American response across the executive branch, the Defense Department, and the alliance structure is not operating from a single coherent script. The gaps between public statements and private actions are wide enough to drive serious consequences through. Third, the economic pressure on ordinary Americans is not a side effect of this situation. It is a central feature of it, and it is accelerating, not stabilizing. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. If this is Iran's final signal, what does America's final answer look like? And perhaps more importantly, who exactly is writing it? I do not have a definitive answer to that. Nobody outside a very small room does right now. But I believe informed citizens who ask the right questions are more valuable than frightened ones who accept the loudest narrative available. That is why I make these videos. And that is why your engagement here genuinely matters. Subscribe right now if you are not already. Share this with one person who deserves the full picture. Drop your assessment in the comments. I read every single one. I am watching 3 specific developments as we speak. The moment any one of them moves, I will be back here immediately. Do not miss it.